Jade Ferguson of the University of Guelph. So Canada has always regarded itself as a democratic nation free from racial discrimination. The country holds fast to the belief in its own superiority, often positioning itself above the morally sullied United States. Abolishing slavery more than 30 years before its southern counterpart and offering asylum to escaped slaves via the Underground Railroad, Canada is revered for its commitment to progression and to egalitarianism. Today, Canada is applauded for its progressive policies concerning multiculturalism, and the country shakes its head in disapproval at Americans for their overt expressions of racism. Our headlines proclaim Black Lives Matter, and our people regard racism as un-Canadian. Every so often, probably at least once a day, a rift occurs between this glorious image of Canadian benevolence and the actual lived experience of its Black citizens. The immense success of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of the Nation, debuting in Toronto amidst a 40-year Canadian moral outcry against the lynching of African Americans, constitutes one of these rifts. This paper will examine how it is possible for a country to denounce lynching while simultaneously praising a chivalric cinematic representation of the Ku Klux Klan. Through the analysis of several articles that were printed in the Toronto newspaper The Globe between 1895 and 1923, I will argue that Canada did not speak out against lynching because Black lives are valuable and deserve protection. Instead, I will argue that Canada opposed lynching insofar as the practice threatened white supremacy. This thesis will be supported by an analysis of the discourse of civilization, a discussion of the appeal to law and order, and finally, by an examination of the disavowal of the existence of racism within Canadian borders. Several articles in the Globe evoke the discourse of civilization to denounce the practice of lynching. In order to show how this use of language fosters white supremacy, we must briefly turn to Julian B. Carter's discussion of the term the heart of whiteness. He observes that late 19th and early 20th centuries, the term civilization was often used as a synonym for whiteness, and the status of civilized was reserved for upper-class North American-born whites of the Protestant faith. An article entitled The Lynching Evil, printed in 1903, quotes a comment made at an evangelical conference in Berlin, Ontario. The speaker says, "We deplore the existence of this great evil as subversive of all government, and express our abhorrence of the atrocities connected with lynching as a revival of barbarism and a reproach to our Christian civilization." As Carter has shown, to speak of civilization is to speak of whiteness. By this logic, to speak of barbarism is to speak of blackness. The abhorrence expressed here is not directed towards lynching, but to something that is connected to it. The speaker suggests that what is abhorred is the reproach to Christian civilization, demonstrated by the practice of lynching. The good names of white Protestants are being sullied by this barbarous activity, which in turn threatens the claims of whites to civilization and to supremacy. After documenting the torture and lynching of 2 African Americans, one mutilated before being hanged, the other burned alive at the stake, the author of Lynching with Torture from 1895 writes, "On the whole, the American press and people seem to fail utterly to recognize the grave danger to civilization these incidents involve." This article makes use of one of Canada's most beloved rhetorical strategies, namely the denigration of the United States. It expresses the Canadian fear in the loss of white supremacy by the use of grave danger. Grave presupposes that there is something terminal at stake in the practice of lynching, and white supremacy is precisely that which is threatened. These articles denounce lynching because the practice makes whites appear as if they lack self-restraint, moral responsibility, and sound judgment, 3 qualities they say they possess in order to justify their dominance over Black people, who are thought to be unrestrained, immoral, and illogical. The insistent appeal to law and order present in the Globe articles also exposes the white supremacist aims of Canadian opposition to lynching, as each argument or sentiment expressed is predicated upon the assumption that Black men are criminals. What is Anarchy, printed in 1901, attributes lynching to the absence of law, stating, "There is doubtless a great deal of crime in the South, of such a character that women cannot walk safely from one farmhouse to another. There is a terrible condition of affairs, but the remedy for it is not lawlessness, but the more effective carrying out of law. The United States could not make a wiser investment out of its vast wealth than to aid the local authorities in policing the South. This author is wholly convinced of the supposed danger posed by free black men and posits that the nature of the threat is rape. This article essentially critiques the United States for its failure to implement an improved, more advanced, more modern whiteness that subjugates black bodies through state-sanctioned biopolitical control. The Lynching in the South, printed in 1899, holds that lynching is problematic in its violation of the law, but sees the phenomenon as a logical response in its absence. The author begins by expressing the Southerners' rationale for lynching, stating that the white man believed that, quote, the savage is always ready to break out of the black man, and for that reason, women and children in the South must constantly be looked out for him. Because the law is, quote, too slow for him, the white Southerner feels that lynching is better. In his own assessment, the author says, one thing the Southern Negro seems to be allowed to do, he may work. And it does not appear, as a rule, the fruits of his labor are denied him. If he accepts life on the white man's terms, works industriously and keeps out of politics, he may prosper and find life tolerable unless a lynching party makes a mistake. The race question in the South is very complex. Great wrongs grow out of it. Yet we should be wary of giving rash judgments on the incidents. So although this author does feel that lynching belongs in a list of great wrongs, he says that Canadians must think before denouncing the Southerners as poor-intentioned people. By prefacing his assessment with the explanation of the Southerners' rationale that black men are a threat to white women, the author sees lynching as the only viable solution against black crime. Lynching becomes the only way to compensate for a law that is, quote, too slow, and it is suggested that if black men voluntarily submit to white men, they would not have to fear the lynch mob. This kind of rhetoric is intrinsic to the maintenance and reproduction of both legal and extra-legal racism. It is an example of race crafting that blames people of color for the existence of racism while alleviating the racist of all responsibility. Neither article dares to challenge the black men as rapist equation, nor do they even entertain the possibility that these murdered men may be innocent. Regarding black men as criminals serves white supremacy, and as David Austin argues, the notion of black predatory sexuality is rooted in the, quote, history of slavery and is an integral part of its aftermath. In times of slavery, black men represented what is, quote, vile, virile, and evil, whereas white women stood for the ultimate form of purity and good. Austin argued that this form of thinking continued through, quote, slavery's persistent aftermath, and today, blacks continue to be perceived as a biological threat, a contaminant in a society in which white women's reproductive capacities are seen as essential to the reproduction of the nation-state. The Canadian belief in the conceptions of black men as rapist and white woman as nation has supposedly given the law license to police and control black bodies in the defense of whiteness. In other words, the racist ideology perpetuated here presents white dominance as a necessary means to ensure national security. The final set of articles to be examined completely disavow the existence of racism in Canada. These articles purport the myth of the North Star, which holds that Canada is a place free from racial discrimination, a, quote, paragon of virtue and a keeper of the democratic spirit. Not Wanted in Canada, printed in 1922, is a fine example of this self-congratulatory rhetoric that is so prevalent in Canadian discourse. The article begins by announcing that the, quote, Attorney General of Ontario gives notice to the Ku Klux Klan that it is not wanted in the province, unquote, and by expressing an opposition to lynching, before going on to say, a thing is not necessarily bad because it comes from the United States, but the Ku Klux Klan is certainly not one of the good things that we ought to import. It is a result of conditions that do not exist here. It had its origin in a race and color difficulty for which there is no counterpart in Canada, and it has been broadened out so as to attract persons having racial and religious prejudices of all kinds. We have had race and religious difficulties in Canada, but we have managed to adjust them without violence. Canada is also a part of the empire in which people of many races, religions, and colors are represented, and British statesmanship aims at justice for all. This author could not be more wrong in his assertion that Canada has managed to adjust its race and religious difficulties without violence. In fact, historical and contemporary examples show that Canada only adjusts race and religious difficulties with violence. Genocide, slavery, residential schooling, Japanese internment, police brutality, mosque burnings, cross burnings. These are just a few examples of how Canada adjusts its race and religious difficulties. Also, the invocation of British statesmanship is an age-old rhetorical move invented by Canadians to mask the de facto segregation that impacted Black people in terms of service, housing, schooling, and employment. Outlook of the Church, printed in 1923, does not so much argue that there is no racism in Canada, as much as it argues that there is no Black presence. It reads, "We hear much these days about the rising tide of color and the menace of the colored races. While Canada is happily free from any such menace within her borders, it is a problem to the south of us that keeps statesmen awake, pondering its solution." It is indeed interesting that this article begins with a reference to the rising tide of color against white world supremacy, an overtly racist book written by Lorthop Stoddard. This book argues that white supremacy is threatened by the increasing number of people of color in the United States, and it calls for the strengthening of the white race via eugenics. The Church agrees with Stoddard insofar as it attributes America's problem to the menace of the colored races, and expresses relief that Canada does not have enough Black people to empathize with this issue. This article not only disavows the presence of Black people that have occupied this land since before it became known as Canada, but is thankful for the way white predominance has thrived in this country. The failure to acknowledge the extent to which Black Canadians were and are discriminated against socially, legally, and economically enables Canadians to maintain a semblance of moral superiority over Americans, while disavowing their own enactments of racism, which in turn enables a perpetuation of white supremacy. These articles come at a critical time in Canadian history, when carefully concealed racism begins to manifest itself. Black Canadians are bringing matters of discrimination to court. For example, the cases of Johnson versus Sparrow and Lowe's Montreal Theatre Limited versus Reynolds involve Black people being denied orchestra seating in public venues. And the cases of Franklin versus Evans and Rogers versus the Clarence Hotel involve men being denied service in taverns based upon the color of their skin. Such manifestations of racism begin to shake the semblance of Canadian moral integrity, and a tactic is needed to reaffirm Canada's self-purported and internationally circulating image. There is no better method for directing attention away from Canada than to point fingers at the American South, where racism is even more explicit. And there is no better medium for spreading ideology than the newspaper. It would be lovely to be able to say that the disavowal of racism is a thing of the past, and that we, as a nation, have learned to identify and rectify issues of discrimination. But as our law enforcement officers trade in their uniforms for white robes, and their actions mimic those of the lynch mobs of old, as demonstrated in the police killings of Dwayne Christian, Michael Elligan, Frank Anthony Berry, Jermaine Carby, Andrew Loku, and many, many more. It is very difficult to maintain belief in Canadian benevolence. Thank you.